Good afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to start a series of two, a pair that's going to look at the idea of power in society. Because a lot of what we've talked about so far has had to do with institutions and their influence on us, or the strength of institutions and how they define us and shape our relationships. We've also talked about the possibility of how people have redefined physical and ideological spaces. So we talked about Paulo Freire and redesigning the classroom to change relationships, and even Gloria Anzaldúa and how to reimagine ourselves and how we relate with other people to change institutions. But something we have yet to go over, which is foundational to all of this. So what is the foundational mechanism of all of this? So broadly in society then, when we're talking about this, we're talking about the ability to define and shape society and the ability to define relationships. This is power in sociology and in society. So the define and shape society, define relationships. This is what power is in society. How we define power in sociology. So here, clearly defined, power is in this sense the ability to define relationships and create the rules. And we'll go into the second part of this on whether hidden or overt in society. So power is a sense of creating rules, creating the official ways in which we define ourselves. So I'm going to go into more detail on this in the next page here. But basic in sociology, we talk about official rules such as laws or regulations. So official rules such as those defined by the police, those defined by legislation. So these are official ones. This is one type. Official rules. The second one, though, down here, are social norms, or the manner of doing things. So social norms are kind of like the values of society. Norms is short for what's normal. This, of course, changes. So, for instance, when you could do a simple thought experiment, if you came into a classroom and someone was standing up on top of the desk and facing away from the front of the classroom, this wouldn't be normal, right? So the norm then we could deduce is that normally a table or a chair is something that you sit in or sit at. And in a classroom, you face the front. This is a norm. This is the way we expect things to be. In an elevator, if you were to come into an elevator, you face towards the door. Otherwise, it'd be strange by facing away towards the wall. These sorts of things. Or even norms just of how closely we stand next to each other when we talk to each other. What is personal space? So these norms are unofficial ones that we gather as we grow up. But these also control us similarly to the way laws do, but maybe in a little bit more of a hidden manner. So sociology always is interested in both of these. Okay? So implications then, this is the main thing we're going to be exploring. So, therefore, implications of power. So if you think about then the ability to have institutions to define what is normal, didn't have a strong influence on us. So the people who define then what is normal, define what we're supposed to do, can have a lot of power in society. And I'll do a little preview of where we're going with this. So start thinking of social media influencers. I think might be a good contemporary example. Social media influencer is someone who may show a certain way of acting, might show values, might show things that they have, cars, technology. These sorts of things could actually shape who we become, how they influence us. So therefore then, and bold and underlined here, those who influence the rules and shape the norms have tremendous power in how we socialize and how we become who we are. Okay? So we're going to take a look at how this works and also see some of the implications of what that means for relationships. Okay, so I'm going to introduce a fellow by the name of Michel Foucault. He looked at power as something that controls us in some ways without knowing it. So he's not as interested in the official rules up here. He's more interested in the social norms. So quickly go in here. Here's what he looks like. Michel Foucault was writing in the early 1900s to the mid-1900s and was essentially a philosopher that started getting interested in social theory. So before we go into his detail, let's go a little bit more detail on direct and indirect forms of control. Okay, so overt and covert power. So I say overt and covert here. Overt is basically, you could just think of it as open, out in the open. So this is obvious power. Covert is hidden, kind of like a spy. Overt and hidden. We'll go into details down here, but there's basically two different versions. So in brief, material or overt control is direct control over people's lives, so usually through force. So examples of this would be something like the police, military, or prison, something you physically see. If you break a law, you might get arrested and go to jail. This is direct control. While the second one that becomes interesting in sociology is the management of influence of how we make sense of the world. So other things are like, on this end, ideological, covert, hidden things, right? So we can use a schooling example. In schooling, again, we talked about something that is hidden. So in a sense, out in the open, on one hand, we might be learning math, right? That's out in the open. But what might be hidden there is we're being socialized to act a certain way. And we've gone into this a lot, but basically, again, like that teachers are more valuable than students. And that students have to respect teachers, respect their opinions, and respect their knowledge. So this is something hidden that we learn in schooling. And you get this in maybe overt ways. In some ways you might get it by having rules of the classroom, don't speak unless spoken to. Often, though, it's more hidden in the sense that you just, over time, you start seeing how your peers act. You start getting either punished or rewarded in direct or indirect ways on how you're supposed to act in the classroom. So in some ways, this is ideological, this is covert control. Over time, you may not even realize it's happening anymore, right? So maybe in the first 1 to 2 years of school, it might have been tough, but by the time you get into college, most of us are going to be very used to how schools run, and we're not even going to question it. We become professional schoolers, okay? Let's see how Michel Foucault looks at this then. So Michel Foucault takes this idea further. He's really interested. He was writing early on. His initial research was the idea of punishment. Like, what does punishment look like in society? But basically, big question he came up with, he was really interested in, is what we're just talking about, is why are people controlled? Why do they do what they do? Because if you think about the old model, punishment used to be more direct. They'd have more direct punishment. For instance, you might think of the stockade. Let's take a look at the images of the old stockade. So something like this. Images of the stockade where people would be trapped like this in a stockade, and that would be more direct forms of punishment. So there was this version of punishment, but now in the modern sense, in the modern world, we don't necessarily see the stockade anymore. Things are more hidden. We have prisons, we have fines, we have different things. It's not as direct anymore. Even capital punishment itself, whereas before it might have been a public spectacle, it's now a private spectacle, something that's private. So in that sense, he noticed that we're not any less compliant than we were before. So how can this form of punishment be just as effective? Okay, so he uses this to start there, and he goes a little bit broader with it. So in a sense before, if you think of this old form of control, so like a second example, if you think of a king being an unjust king, it's really easy to see where the power is here. So the king is up on top. If there's something you don't like about the king, you perhaps get rid of the king and get a new one, and you change society, right? Where in our modern society, a republic or representative democracy, we don't really know what's up on top. You know, maybe technically we might think of the president, we might think of a senator, but it's not as easy to identify where power comes from in our modern society. It's harder to see who's in control. Okay? So Foucault is noticing that in modern times, the nature of control and power have changed. In some ways, he actually sees, it seems that people actually tend to regulate themselves. They don't actually need someone would be constantly watching them or monitoring them. So here he's saying things like the norms or the values of society, so being afraid of what people think of you, regulate us in some ways, he would argue, better than this old way of direct punishment. That in some ways, if we make something unpopular or we make something uncool, then we're more likely to avoid it than we were before. Okay? So what does this look like? So he uses a metaphor here. I have a picture here that I'll pull up a color version of it. So he had a version of this called Panopticon. And we'll go back here again. So Foucault, he was essentially looking again, like I said, he was interested in prisons and punishment. So he actually found an old model of prison right here that he thinks not only represents an ideal form of prison, but it could actually be used in modern society. So let's actually go look at perhaps the color version of this. So as we see here, the image, there's a central tower in the middle, and all the prison cells are all around. So essentially what he's saying is that rather than actually having to have one guard for every prisoner, you could have one guard in the tower, and the prisoner wouldn't actually know when they're being watched. So for instance, if every single prisoner was in one of these cells and you couldn't see if anyone was in the tower or not, you never know when you're actually being watched, when you're actually being regulated. This idea of being watched means that since the prisoner doesn't know when they're being watched, they need to always assume that they are. Meaning that you could actually over time then have a person always assuming that they're being watched. They start not doing, they're not going to try to escape, they're not going to try to change things because they're assuming that they're always being watched. And Foucault would argue that over enough time, with enough time, then someone just adapts this to their norm. So if you could get someone to think they're constantly being watched and regulated, people will regulate themselves, and not only regulate themselves, but they won't worry about it too much because it becomes the norm. Okay? So over time, the habits would become so natural that they would become ideal prisoners. So what we would see this then is Foucault thinks this doesn't just happen in prison, but that this could happen in the modern world as well. That no longer in the modern society do we need punishment. We just have to constantly think we're being watched. So we could bring up several examples here. You can think of at least two. One of them might be surveillance. Modern surveillance systems, if we constantly have cameras watching us, this idea that we aren't necessarily going to break the rules in a store, for instance, if we know we're always being watched. Or if we know that our social media accounts are being monitored. This idea of always being surveilled is even more powerful now than what Foucault could have possibly imagined, right? I think one of the most powerful ones, though, more powerful than Foucault could have even imagined when he was writing, was actually this idea of social media, right? So when we think of social media, we could also think that we're being controlled and regulated not necessarily by official rules, but we're being controlled and regulated in social media without anyone actually having to tell us what to do. We maybe watch what an influencer or see what people are doing, and we'll see what people are posting, and that in itself is enough to kind of control us. So for instance, if you see an influencer who's making a lot of money or is able to show that they've got a new car, got a new home, then this idea then that we want to go to school and be able to make that money too, or we want to be able to find ways that we could earn this money and have that sort of lifestyle. So we're going to be less likely to break the rules. We're going to be less likely to challenge the way things are. So not break rules within reason. We're not going to break rules. Going to regulate our values. And our interests are going to be shaped as well by things that we see. And for instance, you might think that, social media, you'll see people posting things of marriages and baby showers, but you're not going to see someone posting of things of, as often, you're not going to see someone posting things about divorce or breakups. Because so it shapes then, we want to focus on positives and good things. I put quotes here because this is all defined by society. So in a lot of ways then, Foucault would argue then that the more powerful surveillance and technology becomes, the more powerful social media becomes, the less like it is for us to break the rules and to do something we're not supposed to. Rather, we, like the prisoners in this depiction of a prison, are going to start regulating ourselves and doing what we're supposed to do. Okay? So what are the implications then? So if we have power like this again, we're kind of, again, put in this place of uncertainty, like we talked about in a few lectures ago. So in that sense, if we have all this hidden forms of control, covert things controlling us, so how are we going to be able to challenge that? How can we reclaim some of our own influence if we are constantly surrounded, especially now, with images of media, social media, of influencers and ideals that aren't our own? Okay? How do we do that? Something to be thinking about. Is our ability to identify them enough? So for instance, if I am being an astute person of social media and I notice that social media influencers are doing this to me, if I notice it, is it enough for me to change? Can I change at this point? Can I change? Can I resist influence once I know it? Right? So if we could realize the influence of social media, can we then avoid its influence? Right? So if we go a step further again, since we're in marriage and family, what happens then to relationships? Right? So not only are individuals being defined, so not just the individual, but how we relate with other individuals is also defined in this way. Right? So this relationship itself. So you start thinking about, so who has a lot of power in society then? So if we're influenced in this way, that if power to define what a normal relationship is, has a lot of power indeed, right? So if you can control what relationships look like, what people want in a relationship, what people value in a relationship, you could really define what people look like, right? So an example we could think of, if we think of marriage itself, what is marriage and who defines it, right? This has been a contemporary issue that has come up a lot. And we don't have to look that far back in our history to seeing it being closely associated with gender roles. Women's association, traditionally associated with the home, and men's association with work, right? Media depictions subtly reinforce women's out of the workplace and keeping men out of the home. So this idea then of defining marriage in a certain way, we may often think of it as something that's neutral, or it just is. But who has the power to define, to define it? Has a lot of power indeed to define what we look like. So if we can modify what marriage looks like, we could then modify not only what we look like, but also who we relate with looks like. Okay? So this definition itself, this actually changes what individuals could actually imagine doing with their lives. Right? So for instance, if we go back several generations, being defined along these gender roles, men and women have very different ideas of what they could achieve in life. And this also works along roles along race, class, disability, and ability. If we define race looking a certain way, and we define relationships along race to look a certain way, along class, wealthy being a certain thing, maybe wealthy being good in society, right? That's going to change our goals, our values, and our baggage or what we bring into a relationship. So to think of it in Foucault's time, media itself was very influential, but I don't even know how you'd imagine what it was like now with the broad use of social media and the rapid use of technology. Okay? So then, get into our discussion. Are Foucault's ideas still relevant? Are they still relevant? Are they something that we could apply today? Is it not enough? For instance, is this idea of control not enough? Or perhaps Foucault's gone too far. This idea of being controlled by image, is that something that seems ridiculous? Are we actually more able to resist this than before? Are we becoming smarter about media as a society? Can we resist? Okay. So where do you see examples of panopticon taking place in modern society? If we take it seriously, how do images, the goals, and the values from social media and influencers, how do they affect us? And kind of most importantly, really, is how does this affect our relationships? Is it enhance relationships? Does it detract from them? Is there a way that this can be done better, right? And I think as we go through, can we have this I-thou relationship? An I-thou relationship done of respect. Can we have respectful relationships? Or are we going to have objectified relationships? Objectified relationships. Can we be respectful with each other in social media world? Or are we going to be treating each other more like objects? So what do you think of all this? Is Foucault's idea of panopticon, is it still relevant today?